Hello and welcome to today's webcast, hosted by the Sales Management Association. Today's session is one in a series of web-based Sales Management Association presentations that feature practitioners and thought leaders in the field of Salesforce effectiveness. The Sales Management Association is a professional association for sales operations, sales enablement, sales effectiveness and commercial effectiveness, and sales leadership professions. We provide our members with research, case studies, training, peer networking, and professional development. If you are joining us for the first time, we'd like to welcome you and encourage you to visit us online at salesmanagement.org and also to consider membership in the Sales Management Association. Toward that end, we would like to make membership easy and low cost for you if you are a practicing manager in any of the fields that we serve. You may participate in any of the open research initiatives that we have ongoing at any time from our website. If you go to salesmanagement.org/open research initiatives, or just from the main menu, select resources and open research initiatives. You'll find there a set of initiatives, and if you participate in them, we'll upgrade you to our associate membership, which gives you access to many archived webinars and research. So we hope you'll take advantage of this and also help our community build the leading open source set of benchmarks and practice in sales effectiveness. Also, I'd like you to keep an eye out for an announcement we'll make later this week or soon thereafter about a virtual conference addressing our COVID-19 crisis and how members and managers should respond. Please keep an eye out for that. My name is Bob Kelly. I'm pleased to be with you today. I'm chairman and founder of the Sales Management Association. I'm happy to be joined today by Albert Fong from MindTickle. Today, and in fact, I'd like to introduce Albert now. Albert leads product marketing and strategy for MindTickle, a sales enablement platform that equips salespeople with knowledge and tangible skills. Albert has 20 years experience in marketing, enterprise applications, web services, and product leadership, and has deep expertise in sales enablement. Before joining MindTickle, he was Senior Director of Product Marketing at Topia and Director of Product Marketing at Reflective. Albert Fong from MindTickle, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me here today.
Great. Well, today, I'm very happy to be discussing research that is recently completed. In fact, as we often do, as soon as we complete a set of analysis on new research, we do these webinars to share the data with our membership, even before we publish the report. So in today's session, we're going to be talking about research on sales enablement, sales readiness, and generally how sales organizations develop salespeople. It's a good time at this point in our presentation to just explain how different a presentation we thought we would be giving just 10 days ago. So, as of today, we're very much in crisis with COVID-19, and many organizations are really in a pretty chaotic state. I'm sure that's what you see as well, Albert.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, Bob. I mean, normally at this time of year, many of us are typically holding sales events, such as sales kickoffs, sales meetings, quarterly business reviews, which is really all core and integral aspects of building a learning culture and aligning teams towards our organizational goals. But obviously, with the recent events, those things have disrupted those things, and in many ways, those are changing and redefining how we communicate in these times of crisis. And so the survey that we're going to go through, the findings, are going to be pretty important in terms of how we do that, because they're very applicable in these times. And hopefully they also will show us how we can use technology to help us actually minimize some of those disruptive forces to our operations by enabling us to keep employees connected regardless of where your sales teams are working.
Yeah, that's a great thing to point out. I mean, much of what we will discuss today reveals a journey that companies in general and many companies in particular are going through, where they're rethinking how sales and development is delivered and consumed, how sales training and development assets are consumed inside companies. So that journey is now going to accelerate for many of those companies. So we really feel like our findings are most relevant. They're perhaps not presented in the context of crisis management, but though we'll be getting to that over the next few weeks, but they will provide very relevant insight to organizations looking to change how they've delivered traditional training and development assets. Okay, with that said, let's talk a little bit about the research itself. So our format today is I'll walk us through some basic findings. I'll ask Albert to give us a little perspective and help us interpret some of these findings as we go. I'll start with just some general information about the research. Our research was, again, really focused on figuring out how companies train and develop salespeople. It's a big challenge for companies. And what we learned in the research is that it's perhaps even more crucial than we anticipated. So at one level, the basic findings show a range of practices, so it's helpful to benchmark the various levels of activity and practice and training delivery. But we've also taken care to quantify the impact of some of these practices. So our goal was to tease out the best practices and then quantify their impact on business results in the presentation that we'll show you today. Again, some additional background information. We had a little over 120 respondents. They are predominantly from larger firms. More than 60% are from organizations that have at least $100 million US in annual revenues. We didn't have any companies below $1 million in revenue, and we had about 1 in 10 had revenues in excess of $10 billion US. The respondents themselves are chiefly sales effectiveness leaders, that is sales ops, commercial effectiveness, sales enablement, and other sales support positions. An additional 17% are senior sales leaders leading, that is, they are sales managers managing managers. That helps explain. So that's a bit of background on the research itself. Now, let's jump into some insight from the data that we collected. A good question that we might ask is, how well positioned are organizations to develop their sales effectiveness and their sales people? The most important constituent element of what makes a effective sales organization. Here's what we found. We found just 56% of organizations consider their own sales organizations effective today. And in fact, fewer still are actually improving. Just 43% of organizations indicate that they significantly improved sales force effectiveness over the past 12 months. And fewer still indicate that they have effective approaches for developing salespeople. So just 18%. So these are sobering statistics. And the key thing here is that it doesn't bode well for the capability that organizations have to adapt in the future. Your thoughts on this, Albert?
Well, I think one of the things that it highlights is that, we're in a complex, constantly changing business environment. And unfortunately, organizations are, poorly positioned nor have an effective strategy for actually improving or growing their sales teams. That's not to say all companies or organizations, but what these charts show us is that many are just not positioned in the right way. And as we're all currently experiencing, the coronavirus pandemic has certainly impacted activities. As I mentioned, a lot of the sales activities that we would normally be doing, with our sellers, and so that only compounds the issues in terms of developing sales, your sales organization in terms of the skills and capabilities development, but more importantly, just keeping them engaged and aligned with your corporate values and your corporate messaging.
Indeed. Well, let's take a closer look at some of these shortfalls. We can look, first of all, at the effectiveness across a range of selling competencies, if you will. And these are high-level selling activities that most sales organizations would engage in, things like retaining business or demonstrating value to a potential buyer, or even just prioritizing what they do each day. And what we found here is that, remember, 56% of firms are effective overall, but there are some deficits across a pretty wide range of fairly basic selling competencies here. So you can see that 3 of the 6 are considered not effective by a majority of organizations. And if we also look at the ability of these organizations to improve in these areas, so there's an acknowledged deficit in effectiveness here, but over the past 12 months, most of them have not improved. In fact, there's only one exception really to that, and that is that competency of overcoming difficult situations and buyers. In fact, 53% of companies have improved in that over the past 12 months. But otherwise, it's a minority of firms that have improved, and more importantly, fewer firms are improving, as are even effective to begin with. So these data don't suggest we can expect effectiveness to improve in these areas anytime soon. What do you think, Albert?
Well, I think one of the things, to your point, if you look at each of these items, there's significant room for improvement. One of the things, for example, is demonstrating value. I think that should be at the forefront of everything your sales force is doing, because that's really connected to all these other things that are illustrated in this chart. As I mentioned before, every one of us is operating in a complex environment, and one of those complexities is the competitive landscape. So let's just take the tech industry, for example. In any given segment, you're looking at, typically 10 to 15 direct competitors, 30 to 50 indirect competitors, and that's being conservative. And then on top of that, the group of prospects who don't want to do anything or make a change. And so, if your sales force isn't demonstrating value to any of those constituents, your product and solution is already facing an uphill battle. And so if you can't illustrate value, then you're not going to be able to do the other things: retain business, connect with prospects, engage buyers in a meaningful way, or really even overcome difficult situations with buyers. So those things are all connected, and they all lead back to, how do I actually demonstrate value of what my offering is?
Well said. So these data suggest, deficits across areas of competency. We also looked at how training is delivered. So this is another dimension, really, to think about practices and training delivery, the modes of delivery. And what we learned from this data is that organizations really consider salesperson training as a multimodal activity. That is, it involves distributing information in a lot of different places, not just classroom. In fact, all of the things on this chart relate to things besides classroom training, which remains the chief mode of training. But you can see that there are at least 5 things that a majority of companies consider important contexts or settings for training, including peer-based learning, skill, micro-learning, and structured onboarding. Now, let's take a look also at effectiveness, and we'll overlay effectiveness across these ratings of importance. And again, we see substantial lags here. So in fact, there is no single mode of training in this data that a majority of companies are effective at. The most effective is structured onboarding, which is really also acknowledged as most important. So, you know, if you look at the life cycle of how we develop our salespeople, it starts okay, but it goes down from there. So this really represents a key issue.
Yeah, I would add, you know, where do you, where to begin on this, on these findings? I mean, we know how difficult the job market is for hiring. So the success or lack of or lack of success really begins with your new sellers, especially with your new hires, begins with onboarding. And in many ways, when you think about onboarding, onboarding begins before onboarding even begins. And that means, you know, you really need to be have a clear picture, a clear and accurate picture of your current onboarding effectiveness, which means identifying the strengths and weaknesses of your sales team with an understanding of who your least and most effective sellers are. So, for example, if you're a CRO, you already realize the importance of shortening ramp-up time. The whole point there being so that your sellers can actually meet their quotas sooner and much more effectively. And so coaching, micro-learning, gamification all pertain not only to sharing knowledge, but the underlying message is that you need to engage your sellers and keep them engaged, especially in the current environment.
Yes, indeed. Well, good. Well, anyway, this is additional insight we've just covered on why training and effectiveness even has such significant shortfalls in most organizations. Let's look now at just some basic training practices. These are things that we collected insight on in the course of our research, and I think most organizations will find interesting. So the first thing we looked at was classroom training. We found classroom training, there's still quite a lot of it being done, although the amount varies widely. It averages for organizations 6.8 days per salesperson per year. Now, there are 25% of organizations that do significantly more. They do 10 or more days, or excuse me, 8 or more days. And then there are another 25% of firms that do 2 or fewer days per salesperson. But nevertheless, classroom training remains sort of the anchoring investment for organizations in training salespeople, and it also remains the sort of anchoring experience for many salespeople when they, you know, learn something substantive. It almost always happens first in a classroom. We also learned that manager observation similarly varies pretty widely across organizations. So the average is 3 hours per salesperson per week of manager observation. And this doesn't mean necessarily one-on-one observation. It's simply managers understanding what happens in the sales process by directly observing. So again, lots of variation here. 25% of firms, 1 in 4, observe salespeople 1 hour per week or less, and another quarter of them observe salespeople 4 hours or more per week. So Albert, what are your thoughts on that? Surprised?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the question of what if you could make training much more consistent and ongoing. You know, one of the things that we often talk about is the use of virtual engagements. as one way to promote regular engagement with sellers. So again, consider the complexity of your business. For example, if you're in, let's just say you're in the medical devices space or the med tech space, there's a strong degree of technically complex materials and information that your sellers need to constantly understand and stay on top of. And compliance is another issue that comes up that's even more important for regulated industries. So beyond medtech, that applies to financial services. And so that emphasizes the need for much more consistent training on a regular basis, both in person and in the virtual environment. The other part of it is really more about, to your point, Bob, about manager oversight and manager feedback. I mean, to really have a clear picture of how your reps are performing, you really need to have much more regular check-ins, not only just in terms of how they're closing deals, but really, are they completing the learning modules and the training modules? Are they applying what they've learned? And then, are they sharing that information? Those are all things that are important, that come with regular manager feedback and a regular dialogue between the managers and sellers.
Yeah, smart managers know what's going on. So I really feel like this is not just about oversight, it's about educating management so that they can direct their effort even more intelligently. And this notion of manager involvement in training is one we're going to talk about right now. So let's actually, one other quick stat of interest. We found that the average amount of time spent by a salesperson in developmental activities represents about a quarter of their time, 26% of the time. And this includes everything: classroom, consuming online things, consuming content of all sorts, peer interaction, etc. So again, this is an average, lots of variation in this approach. Okay, yeah. So let's, go ahead, Albert.
Oh, what I was going to add, Bob, is, one of the things I think is often overlooked is how effective we are in peer sharing of information. And really, it goes back to this basic notion of, you learn so much from the people that you work with. You learn so much from the best practices from your best sellers, best sales reps, and that information needs to be shared consistently and in an effective way. I mean, I think typically what I've seen has been the use of Slack for sharing information, but that's really kind of in the scheme of things, very basic, and in many ways it's a black hole when you're looking up for information or want examples, for example, for instance, right? So in many ways, that's where having a much more structured environment within a structured platform for sharing information comes in and becomes much more useful in terms of making sure that you are actually providing the right level of information, not just in structured courses, but also in terms of anecdotal information, in terms of real life situations, in terms of real life experiences.
Very good. Thank you, Albert. So let's keep moving. We're going to go now to just some basic information about foundational approaches that companies take. That may be not the best title for this section, but in fact, I wanted to revisit this notion we began talking about just a moment ago, which is, what is management's appropriate role? Substitute for management, the company. I mean, how should companies think about what they do to educate and develop salespeople? So let's look at some things. The first thing I want to point out is that in most organizations, managers are not accountable for developing salespeople. They're certainly interested in that, you might surmise, but they're in the majority, in fact, in 60% managers, in just 46% are managers accountable for salesperson development. The other thing is that in most organizations, salespeople develop because they are self-directed to do that. And that's kind of the prevailing mindset of 60% companies. Now, what we teased out of this data, we looked at this data and we compared these companies and how they answered those questions with their sales productivity. And we found, in fact, that an interesting dynamic is that those organizations that agree with both of those statements, that is, that managers should be held accountable and that salespeople really should be self-directed in their development, had a pretty substantial advantage over the organizations that believed neither of those statements, or at least that agreed with neither of those statements. And I think that's perhaps as people might have guessed. There's a 12% differential there in productivity based on just the organization's sales objective achievement. Where it gets interesting is here, if you just had to believe in one of those assertions, that is, managers are accountable for salesperson development or salespeople are self-directed in development, you might just wonder, well, I just have you try to guess what you think the better performing approach is. And I think you might be surprised, as we were, when we looked and saw that the organizations where managers are held accountable, whether or not salespeople were self-directed, outperformed peers by 30% in sales productivity, whereas those firms where that you can infer simply relied on salespeople to be self-directed but didn't hold managers accountable, they underperformed in sales productivity by 22%. I was quite surprised by this. What about you, Albert?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I think in general, salespeople are generally independent when it comes to, the type of information they access and the information they use. But I go back to the whole point, which we all realize is that things are really complex out there, both in the environment and in the solutions and offerings that companies offer, and so it basically puts a spotlight on the need for providing guidance and structure in terms of how that information is used, and really, again, it goes back to the other point of the need for managers to provide more guidance and be held accountable. I will say this, that in many cases, sometimes managers really aren't given the tools or the training to be effective in that aspect, and so that really highlights a need for organizations to make not only managers more accountable, but also give them the training to provide the right level of feedback and the right level of guidance that they can offer to their sales teams.
Yeah, it's fair to point out that this is more complicated than it sounds. You can't simply hold a manager accountable without, quickly sweating the details of just how you do that. Do you pay them differently? And in fact, how do you define what development is? So this is a trap. I call it the salesperson self-direction trap, and it refers to our over-reliance on the independent agency of the salesperson as an autonomous person in the organization. But it also speaks to the over-reliance that we have on measuring and managing salespeople strictly on financial performance in the near term. And so those two things together, I think, conspire to create this blind spot for managers where they're not really understanding that, in fact, though it's great to have self-directed salespeople, the direction they're going in is important, and management has to provide that direction. So the additional things we learned from our data were that many of these elements of just kind of fundamental direction and support of development don't really exist. For example, just 45% of companies give salespeople a blueprint of the skills they need to be successful. Just 34% believe that their own salespeople understand their developmental needs. So they just don't have awareness of what they should be working on, self-directed or not. Just 30% assess the effectiveness of their learning activities. Managers observe salespeople, how they're doing and how they're applying learning, and just 44% of companies. And in just 40% of companies do managers believe their organizations have made the right technology decisions related to learning and development. So lots of gaps here, I think, and perhaps all within this overarching issue of management involvement versus salesperson involvement. All right, so let's talk now about some of the things we did to tease out which practices have the greatest impact on results. And when we look at these business outcomes, we really looked in three areas. We looked at sales productivity. So that's defined as how the organization, its success in meeting its firm sales objective over the past 12 months. And that's how we define sales productivity. The second thing we looked at was sales effectiveness. That is a self-rating of overall effectiveness, which is slightly more subjective than the first thing. And then lastly, we looked at the amount of improvement, and this is a effectiveness rating essentially for sales training. So we looked at, thirdly, sales training effectiveness. And the first practice we identified has to do with classroom training. We found basically that the more classroom training that is done, the better the results in sales productivity, in improvement, and also in training effectiveness. So we found firms that have the most classroom training, that is, they're in the top quartile. They do 10 days or more on average per salesperson. They have sales productivity results 16% higher than their peers. They have 18% greater improvement in sales effectiveness, and they are 18% more effective, I should say. And their improvement and training effectiveness is 12% higher. I point out something here, which is because training is such a big component, because classroom is such a big component of overall training, I interpret these results chiefly as training activity, not just classroom activity. So I think that's what we're seeing here is the more training generally, the higher the correlation with improved results.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it certainly highlights the fact that more is better. I mean, the other part of this is that, sales forces are made up of individuals with very specific strengths and deficiencies, which means the old school cookie cutter approach really misses the mark. And so regular engagement, both in person and virtual, is really essential for building an engagement with your sales team. And like I've said before, given how the current situation and everything else that's going on in the world, conducting regular and consistent engagements, whether those are events, whether those are any specific activities, is even more important. One other thing that I would highlight is we often think that classroom training is difficult. I mean, the other way to think of it is that virtual training, virtual environments actually provide much more flexibility and opportunity for adaptive learning, because you can quickly create a curriculum that's more timely, much more relevant, and much more appropriate based on current conditions.
Indeed. Let's look at our next practice that we looked at, and this is the level of observation manager to salespeople. And what we found here is that those companies that invested more management time and observation, they enjoyed higher rates of sales productivity about 8% higher. That is, those companies that observe salespeople on average 4 hours or more per week. Keep in mind that the average is about 3 hours, so this isn't a huge increase from that, although there are many companies that observe just 1 hour. 1 in 4 companies only observe salespeople 1 hour per week. So these are substantial gains, or significant gains, I should say. This one, though, is perhaps more modest than others. And I'd point out something, which is, managers typically have demanding spans of control. So they have really more people than they can often look after. And so if you were to say, okay, we're going to ramp up your observation time from 7 hours per week to 28 hours per week, you're going to quickly run up against a bandwidth issue. So to make these sorts of changes work, to increase observation time, a couple things are important. One is, you have to divest low value activities from managers. So get rid of the stuff that's not important if you can, if that exists. And let's be candid about the fact that it exists everywhere for almost every manager. And then the second thing I think should do is look for ways to double up. So look for ways to observe multiple salespeople at once, and or to find additional management observers. So anyway, some quick thoughts there. Have any thoughts on this one, Albert?
Yeah, I do. I would say that, when we talk about manager observation, it's not simply about sitting in on sales calls. It's really about implementing things such as role plays and coaching opportunities and having regular check-ins. And so in many ways, what this all leads up to is that you're building a culture of feedback, and basically a two-way dialogue between you on the manager side with your sales force. And that's essentially, that's how you keep that. That's really it's an integral part of keeping your team engaged. It makes them much more receptive to different opportunities, learning opportunities, and frankly, that's how that really becomes a foundation for getting them aligned in terms of your corporate positioning, your messaging, and really the value that you're instilling in your product, and then obviously in the conversations that they have with prospects.
Good. Our next practice is developing learning objectives collaboratively. And this is an interesting one because it didn't necessarily show compelling gains across the board in our 3 areas of business impact, but it did show that organizations that use a combination in originating these learning objectives, that is a combination of management input and salesperson input, actually showed improved sales productivity far greater than firms that simply mandated learning objectives by managers, and even better than those organizations that allowed salespeople to have the greater discretion in determining their own objectives. So 14% improved sales productivity for this one, 17% greater overall effectiveness, and 8% improvement in sales training effectiveness. So some significant gains here. And the key here, it seems to be not so much whether that balance is 50-50 manager salesperson, or is it tilted more toward salespeople. What's very clear about this data is that if you mandate objectives strictly from management's point of view, you're signing up for a pretty substantial penalty in performance. So collaboration with these objectives is key.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it certainly highlights the ability to share best practices and different perspectives. And those things are key to growing a seller into a trusted advisor with prospects. In fact, one company in the business networking space, for example, that I work with has created peer and leader learning circles. And the whole intent here is to actually share and harness feedback within the organization, so that it's not simply, we're not simply giving you a set of courses to go through. We're actually taking information from peers and actually encouraging everyone to collaborate, to have conversations, to really share that information. So one of the underlying things here for this set of findings is, it's really be open to serving as a mentor to further capitalize on your seller's energy and enthusiasm. Really enthusiasm not only for your organization, but also to reach their make their quota, to reach their personal goals and their professional goals.
Yes, good. Well, let's talk now about how we customize training for salespeople. I want to show 3 charts here. I want to show each of these business impact areas separately. And we looked at firms based on whether or not all or mostly all of their training was the same, whether about half is customized to salespeople, or whether most or all is customized. And we found that in terms of sales productivity, those firms that customize about half of their training are, in fact, most productive. When we look at sales training effectiveness in isolation from overall sales effectiveness, and when we look at improvement, which I'll show in this slide, it's clear that firms that are customizing training enjoy much more effective training, and they are much faster and better at improving salesperson effectiveness. So their rates of improvement are substantially better. So the key here seems to be that those organizations that really need to improve and those that are currently lagging in effectiveness and have ground to make up have to abandon this sort of one-size-fits-all or generic training approaches. They seem to really hamstring companies' ability to improve. Though if you can customize training, you've got much, much better prospects for improving salesperson development and outcomes. And I'm sure this is nothing new to you, right, Albert? I mean, this is kind of what you preach to your clients at MindTickle.
We do. I mean, it goes back to really understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your sales team, and really assessing each seller's industry knowledge, sales skill set, their relationships, their network, and then really determining whether your sellers have the right level of experience and training. And how do you, I mean, the question probably is going to be, how do you do all this? Well, it really begins with establishing the right benchmarks and reviewing the analytics. So the way we've done it, our platform does it, is we actually have a set of analytics that provides a unified metric that measures sales readiness to achieve business outcomes. So this goes back to highlighting. It essentially boils down to highlighting capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses in sellers. It pinpoints those capabilities with the most impact on sales incomes, and then more importantly, it then helps you prioritize and personalize readiness programs. I mean, I can go on and on about developing customized programs that address these gaps, but really that's really the foundation for how you'll see significant improvement. And then, just another point to add is, we hear a lot of big buzz. We hear artificial intelligence and machine learning as big buzzwords right now, but the technology is really effective for providing that level of customized content automatically. So in many ways, for example, depending on how a seller performs on a certain learning module within a platform or within a readiness platform, for example, the artificial intelligence component can either provide supplementary information or content if they perform poorly, or move them onto other content. But the whole point here is that it provides content that's relevant to the skill level of the seller. So again, it goes back to this whole point of really being able to address those specific strengths and weaknesses of your sellers, and then developing a program that's really customized to them.
Great. So the next question might be, how often should you deliver the content? We really wanted to look at this notion of training delivery frequency. We did it in a pretty simple fashion. We isolated the firms that provided training just once annually, and those that said they had a much more continuously delivered strategy, and then those in between that delivered training several times annually. So we found that in terms of sales productivity, this is a similar dynamic to the customization one, but the firms that are sort of in the middle, like Goldilocks, are those that in fact enjoy the highest advantage in sales productivity. But the firms that, and incidentally, that's also true in overall sales training effectiveness, or at least the numbers are quite similar. So, these are almost these would be within the margin of error for this analysis. The real benefit that we saw has to do with improvement in sales effectiveness. And we found that those firms that are delivering content more frequently are substantially outperforming peers in the rate of improvement in effectiveness. So the sort of rather straightforward conclusions about how often you should deliver training. If your focus is on improving effectiveness, the more continuously delivered, the better. If your focus is on productivity, I think it's possible to dial that back. Again, you are potentially sacrificing productivity when you refocus on training. And perhaps that's the dynamic that we're seeing in that data. But the grave mistake is to attempt to train once annually. No matter how good that training is, you're positioning yourself at a substantial performance disadvantage compared to peers if your training is that episodic. All right, any thoughts?
Yeah, Bob, I would add that in, when you think of, we just talked about customization, but really customization and frequency go really hand in hand. So regular updates, automated notifications all help with knowledge retention. There's this, with time, what happens with knowledge is that it decays exponentially. It's what they call the forgetting curve. So, so we forget new information relatively quickly. We forget 50% of new information in an hour, and in 30 days, you forget 90% of it. So that really highlights the need for really increasing frequency. And one of the tools that's usually pretty effective, that's really effective in knowledge retention, is what we call space reinforcements. So those are really quizzes and short learning content that's developed on a given topic or concept, and then they're delivered at a pre-configured cadence, basically on a semi-regular basis in time sequences, and then they adapt to an individual's learning needs based on how he or she performs on that content. And then, of course, if a seller needs more help, Readiness platforms using AI can then provide additional information to address those specific trouble areas. Again, I go back to the whole point of the need for customization, but that's only one half of it. Frequency is the other component to it, and you can tell just by looking at the findings here that frequency does make a difference.
No, that's great. Yeah, these are really fundamentally different ways of thinking about training. So let's talk about something I'm going to call the widening gulf. It's really the growing separation between firms that are doing well in these areas and those that are not yet. And you might think of this as both a vicious and a virtuous cycle of compounding reinforcement when it comes to firms that are effective and firms that are improving. And what we found in our data was that the firms that are least effective are also those least likely to be improving. And that's true for firms that are not effective currently, somewhat effective, and then those that are effective are improving substantially greater or faster and more than their peers. And the opposite of this is also true. If you look at the firms that are improving, they are also those that are the most effective. And so, in fact, we found the firms that have shown substantial improvement are 3 times more effective than those that show little to no improvement. And the firms that are effective are 79% more likely to have shown improvement than firms that are ineffective. So this should add additional seriousness to this notion that organizations, their effectiveness is really ephemeral. There's so much change happening that no organization can stay put. And also this core capability of developing people and improving effectiveness is really critical to effectiveness in both the current and the short-term future for almost any organization. All right, so with that sobering observation, let's try to sum up, and then we'll take some questions. So I did prepare some summary observations. I have several pages of these, so I won't go through them verbatim, but I will call out a few things that we touched on that I think are most important. So the first is that many sales organizations are not effective, but even fewer are improving, and even fewer still have effective capabilities to develop salespeople. So these data don't bode well for the future. So organizations really have to change their ability to affect improvement by focusing on salesperson development. Also, sales development these days is increasingly multimodal, though it's still very much grounded in classroom learning. And at least it was pre-crisis. So organizations will have to find ways of adapting that huge fraction of training investment focused in classroom. And they'll also have to take cues from the best companies, what they were doing previously, which is using technologies to augment and to reinforce and to amplify that classroom training in ways that improve outcomes. Also, a few things. This notion that salespeople as self-directed agents can develop on their own is a trap in many organizations, because in fact we demonstrate with our data that that can't be done without significant management direction and also some basic support things. We did quantify the impact of various training practices, and they could be summarized as the following. More training is better. More training equates to greater sales productivity as well as improvement and more effective training. Training that includes collaborative objective setting is significantly more impactful than training that is mandated by management. Similarly, customized training and training that is continuously delivered, they show significant and really compelling advantages in performance over static and generic training. Also, lastly, this notion us and have to understand which they are in and make investments to break that cycle. So, or if not to break it, to keep it going if they are in the minority of firms that are both effective and improving. Yeah, so Albert, before we take some questions, any closing thoughts on what we've covered?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of your observations are on point. I think it definitely highlights a few things, right? It highlights the need for customization and frequency in terms of the training. It certainly highlights the need for manager feedback and manager accountability. And I think an underlying part of this is the need for analytics and metrics. If you want to be able to develop an effective platform, an effective curriculum, and an effective structure for training and for developing your sales force, not only just on product knowledge, but really on skills and capabilities, you really need to have a clear understanding of where they're coming from, what their strengths are, what their deficiencies are. And that really points back to having a strong set of analytics and benchmarks to do that. And then on top of that, it goes back to knowledge retention. How do you actually facilitate and create an environment for knowledge sharing and knowledge retention? And I think really it just points to all the things that we just talked about in terms of how do you help your sellers, your sales force demonstrate value. So I think in general it is very much about understanding that all involves having regular engagement with your sellers and making sure that everyone is aligned.
Great. Well, we'll now take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, feel free to submit it and we'll get right to those. Here's one that I like. I'm going to read it. It says, given that the data suggests a virtuous or a vicious cycle for sales force effectiveness for those firms that currently need to improve, what is the key step they can take to transition from that vicious cycle to the virtuous cycle of success and improvement? I'll let you tackle it first. I'll try to think of something really smart while you talk, Albert.
Well, I think, the one way to think of it is, I always think of it this way. Part of it is that many organizations are set in their ways. And so when you're implementing, say, a new structure or a new direction, part of that really begins with change management. And so, before you implement a lot of those things or tools or head into any kind of direction, part of that really is involving really developing a team, for example, a cross-functional team where you're actually gathering feedback from different parts of your organization. So that can be, obviously that can be at the CRO level, CMO level, all the way down to the sales team, and really developing really much more of a wider perspective of, not only just getting buy-in, but really developing, as you develop this plan, really getting the feedback that you need to actually develop a plan to do this. And, the other part of it is, I'll go back to this, is, that the need for much more transparency and visibility and, into how the organization from a sales perspective is doing in terms of performance and training. And much of that, again, goes back to having the right type of analytics and the metrics to do that.
I think that's well said. I think putting something like that in place helps you understand, what's important. And so if I were to answer this question, I'd answer it really basically. I'd say, make sure you have a lot of confidence around what it is that you want salespeople to do and what it is that they have to know and learn in order to do those things. And those are two very difficult questions for many organizations. So anyway, I guess that's where I'd start. If you've got solid answers to those questions, then I think it's a function of getting better data, better insight, knowing better what's happening in the field, and where to fill the gaps. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Please comment on the following. The problem is not the availability of performance improvement help, but the problem is CEOs and chief sales officers that don't know what they don't know and what could be done to improve sales performance. So I guess this person's saying really the biggest challenge may be that there's not leadership endorsement for development. So I guess they're asking, what do you do about that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I would go back to, so let's say from a leadership perspective, right? Take it from a CRO perspective. A CRO is typically going to be focused around revenue and revenue streams and revenue channels. And really, a CRO is typically going to be thinking about how do I actually maximize what I do have revenue-wise in the channels that I do have, and then the other part of it is thinking through what are additional revenue channels, potential revenue channels that I should be considering, and how do I maximize that? Well, from a CRO perspective, part of that, it begins with the sales force. And so the way I always think the way a CRO, for example, or how to speak to a CRO about this is really going to be around how do I actually make sure that I actually have the sales team to support your revenue objectives, to meet your revenue outcomes. And again, that begins with not just hiring a group of salespeople. It begins with understanding what type of salesperson do I need? And then more importantly, once I bring them on board, how do I make sure that they're being onboarded correctly? How do I make sure that I'm providing the right type of information for them to be successful? Because, in one of the slides that Bob covered, which was around onboarding, typically what happens is onboarding is seen as almost, a purely sales enablement function where, you give them a set of training materials and then you set them off, and background materials on the product, and then you set them off to do what they need to do. But the reality is onboarding is really where it begins in terms of setting the right path for a sales rep when they're starting. And that's where a CRO comes into play in terms of getting their strategic insights about what is the bigger goal for the company revenue-wise, and what should I be considering in terms of the whole onboarding process. The CRO may not be involved in the day-to-day in terms of creating courses or anything like that, but they are involved in terms of the strategy, and that strategy typically is going to be important in terms of educating how do I actually develop a sales enablement program and curriculum that will help meet those outcomes. Same thing with addressing, say, a CMO. CMOs these days are taking on much more of the responsibility around revenue in terms of the marketing campaigns, the demand gen campaigns. And so again, from a CMO perspective, it's about how do I actually, I run all these campaigns. How do I actually make sure that the sales reps are having the right type of conversations? Are they talking about the right level of value that my product offers? Are they able to talk about the messaging and position the company in the right way when they're having these conversations in support of these demand gen conversations in terms of these campaigns that I'm running? Again, a lot of these things are relevant for the C-level executives because they all tie back to the revenue outcomes, both directly and indirectly.
Well, Albert, thank you. I'm sad to say we're out of time. In fact, we're just a minute or two over, so I'll quickly draw us to a close. I'd like to thank you, Albert Fong from MindTickle, for joining us today, and also for your organization's underwriting support of this really interesting and excellent research. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
I'll also remind our audience before we sign off that our next Sales Management Association webcast is April 15, when we'll host a session on compensating recurring revenue streams. You can learn about this session and many other sessions on our website at salesmanagement.org. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. Thanks again for your time and attention today. Goodbye until next time.